Vince, are you good? Okay, let's go ahead and get started.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. I'm Vince Davis, and I am the board chair for AEMO, Aspiring Emergency Managers Online. Welcome to this evening's Emergency Management Roundtable series, which brings together thought leaders, practitioners, and emerging professionals for candid conversations on the evolving challenges of disaster preparedness, response, recovery, and resilience. Each session explores new perspectives, data-driven practices,
It's
and
unbelievable.
equity-centered approaches
The-
that strengthen the field and inspire collaboration across sectors. This EM Roundtable is presented in partnership with AEMO, the Emergency Management External Affairs Association, the State of Disaster podcast hosted by Matt Green, and Pierce College Emergency Management Program. American Sign Language interpretation is provided by Spoken Here, with Mandy Fry interpreting tonight's session. So, first thing I want to do is to invite you to tonight's session, which we're very excited about. One of the most distinguished voices in today's field of emergency management. Uh, our guest today is Dr. Sherman Gillums Jr., and he's here tonight to talk about accessibility and inclusion in emergency management. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping rules. This session will be recorded and shared with AEMO members and partners. Feel free to keep your video off. Please mute your microphone when you're not speaking to minimize background noise. Use the chat feature to submit questions or comments during the presentation, and we will be moderating the chat for questions. We'll have dedicated time at the end for questions and answers with Dr. Gillums. Please be respectful and allow others to share their thoughts without interruption. If you experience any technical issues, please send a message in the chat to Elizabeth Estrada or email Brandy Hunter at brandyhunter.net. That's BRANDI at brandyhunter.net. Should you lose your connection or for some reason are unable to join back into Zoom. Now I'm going to pass the discussion over to tonight's roundtable facilitator, Sarah Miller. Sarah is the chair and associate professor of emergency management program at Pierce College with extensive experience in higher education and community resilience. Sarah is dedicated to preparing the next generation of emergency management professionals through hands-on learning, collaboration, and real-world problem solving. Sarah, welcome and over to you.
Thanks so much, Vince. Thanks again for having me tonight, Brandy. It's always my pleasure to fill in for Matt Green when he can't be here. It's been actually delightful. I've gotten to interview two just absolutely fantastic people, and I'm looking forward to another one. I am Sarah Miller. I am from Pierce College, and I will be leading this session with Dr. Gillums. So Sherman Gillums Jr. currently serves as the Senior Director of Public Policy and Advocacy for the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation. He served 12 years in the United States Marine Corps, joining at age 17, and was honorably discharged at the rank of Chief Warrant Officer 2 due to a career-ending spinal cord injury. After a period of rehabilitation, he began the next phase of his life as a National Service Officer candidate with Paralyzed Veterans of America, eventually rising to become the National Executive Director for the organization. This is a really long intro, but I'm going to go to the very end of it because I know we're really here to hear his thoughts on disability and inclusion in emergency management. So with that, I will just add that he holds a master's degree from the University of San Diego School of Business Administration and a doctoral degree from the University of Dayton. And with that, welcome, Dr. Gillums.
Thank you, Sarah. I really appreciate you shortening that intro. If folks care, they can go read it for themselves. But I think the one part of my resume, perhaps that I'm most proud of, is I served as the disability coordinator and the director of the Office of Disability Integration and Coordination at FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, for 3 years. That ended back in February. There were a lot of changes that happened. I'm not going to focus on that, but I will say that I probably learned more about the human condition and the greatness of this society when we get people like you all here to gather together to save lives and help people recover. Of course, we just had a major hurricane happen in Jamaica, Hurricane Melissa, I believe, and it was probably one of the worst we've seen in a while. I think it reached Category 5 at some point, and for me and for the role that I played at FEMA, I got to go to those places in the immediate aftermath and take in a bit of irony on two fronts. One, disability and disasters don't discriminate. They care nothing about your demographical boundaries. And when you bring the two together in a way that we've seen in places like Florida, Puerto Rico, Jamaica at the latest, it can have devastating effects. And that's why what you're doing here is so important, given the changes that happen at the federal level, community level, and regional level. Response is going to be so important. So I'm glad to be here to have this discussion. I'll probably see some familiar faces. I think I saw Jenny in there, but I'm glad to have this discussion with you all.
I think we call them the usual suspects.
I
So I'm
used to be
gonna
one of
just
them.
I'm gonna kick this off with a very loaded question. What
Mhm.
challenges do people with disabilities face during disasters, both major or minor disasters?
I'm going to answer it kind of with a rhetorical question. If you think for a minute, what do you think is the biggest fear that people with disabilities face across disasters, across regions? And and I had to ask that question because I made assumptions, right? I thought in my head, well, they'll fear this and they'll fear that. Well, most people I've talked to at least fear was having to leave the confines of an environment where they have directed everything. And sometimes it has fatal effects because it's not a danger to the person until it's too late in a lot of cases. And we saw a lot of this during Hurricane Katrina. And I think the biggest problem I see at this point is how do you get people to make better decisions in their own interest in a way where they have to trust a system that has let them down so many times? If you don't have accessibility in your environment when there's no disaster, it's not going to get better. And I think the best way the work that we do is, at least we did at FEMA, was to talk to communities about preparation being the first response. That's really when the first response happens. After that, you're really deep into the problem of the disaster. And that starts also with societies at those community levels being accessible in the first place. So people have more places to go that's ideal for them if they have to stay there for a long time. So now, my short answer would be that, we have to get people to be thinking about preparation as a first response.
Well, and I think you hit on something that's a universal theme. Having been a local emergency manager, when we talk about sheltering and evacuations, nobody wants to go. Nobody wants to go hang out with 1,000 of their new best friends in a shelter. Some people have the option to go, and some people like that not wanting to go has very different things. Some you just don't want to go because you don't want to go, or maybe you don't want to go because you're pretty sure that your durable medical equipment isn't going to work in that space, or they're not going to have a refrigerator for your medication, or there's going to be stairs or other things you can't navigate. And I think so there's a universal in there, but there's also the difference of how we have failed to address those things in our community on a daily basis. So how do you think that communities can go about changing this?
It starts with being at the table, and these are things that we've said ad nauseum. You have to have people at the table. When I was in the National Response Coordination Center, we would actually take phone calls from the field from people who were in trouble, and we would have them referred to us. I remember getting a call not a direct call, maybe it was patched through by another group, but there was a mom with two adult sons with autism who had decided that they were better off sheltering in place in her car, not because it was safer, not because of anything that had to do with the disaster. She feared that the people in the shelter would misunderstand her two grown boys, that their behavior was related to something that had nothing to do with, criminal conduct or, anything like that. It's just the fact that she didn't want to have to even deal with having to explain and educate those folks in the midst of all the other stressors. So I think having those conversations beforehand, before you get to that point where you have to explain to somebody that my child is not misbehaving, the sensory overload, and these are things that are sort of common if you're in this work, but for some reason you still encounter people who are in positions where they have to do important work, but then they have to quickly understand the different types of people that they're trying to help. And that can be tough if you're a person who has bumped your head against doors like that all the time. When you run into it at restaurants, you run into it, when there's no disaster. And then when there's a disaster, people don't get more understanding. So I think it's important within this work, this sector, that more people, and we've got a lot of people that are awful aggressive, but then you have turnover in the emergency management business. And you have to constantly keep going back and making sure that folks are educated about the needs that are pretty complex, but they're not impossible to understand. There's some things that are pretty basic. So having more people willing to step up and say, hey, I need to be included. And if they don't include you, fight to be included. I think that's the only way to really get people to understand where the change needs to happen is well before the disaster.
Yeah, you hit on something that I think is a recurring theme. What's happening post-disaster is just a reflection of what was happening pre-disaster, but often with a magnifying glass on the really best and really worst of what was happening. And you see this, right? Like people experience discrimination, they experience bias, just living their authentic lives as they are, and that's a hard thing to it's a hard thing to overcome on the day to day. And then you get to a disaster and everything's amplified. And I've seen too in our own community where people have chosen to sleep in a vehicle outside of the shelter because
Right.
it was more comfortable for a variety of reasons. And having a conversation, sometimes that's the best choice, and sometimes there's a different choice we can help facilitate.
Yeah.
So so what and you're right. We've talked about these things for my entire life, that's for sure, probably longer. Does it feel like we're making progress, or does it feel like we're just stuck?
The only reason why I hate answering that question is because I can say what it looks like to me, but you've got people out there that are suffering, that are still not recovered in Puerto Rico, still not recovered in the Carolinas from Hurricane Helene and Milton, still not recovered from Ian. There are people who have been unhoused, they have been displaced, institutionalized, and they get lost in the sauce. And so for me to say it's gotten better would be not to honor the suffering that they go through. And I think it really depends on what's reflected back to me. I can say whatever I want, but what's reflected back oftentimes is you get a lot of people that are helped, right? It's always good to, acknowledge that there are people that get help, but the people that don't get helped are oftentimes already at the margins.
Mhm.
And like you said, it only accentuates what was already wrong. So to be fair, we didn't bring the problem in. When I say we, the emergency managers, we didn't bring those pre-existing issues, but we certainly didn't help by not calling them out, especially if we're there to help build back better, which is kind of what we were trying to do for my last 3 years, is not build it back to what it was before. If you can make it more accessible, every bridge, every pathway for evacuation, every shelter. Some shelters are not accessible. Well, y'all pick that building. And if that was slim pickings, then maybe you need to have more buildings to pick from that can accommodate. And we'll see things like churches that are well-meaning, but the churches fall under some of the grandfathered in, and they don't have to have the slopes and all that stuff. So what's problematic is oftentimes we have to deal with the understanding of the situation as it was when the disaster hit, and it's especially bad when it's a disaster where there's no notice, where you didn't have a tornado, and I've seen those, because you really have to just accept what's there, and that means we have to do better with what's there in the first place.
And I think that's I just keep saying I think these are really important points because they are. I should just
Yeah,
stop saying that part. But I look particularly at rural communities where your infrastructure, you might not have any modern buildings and you might be making do. But I also see that communities will come together and work towards solutions as long as nobody gets in their way. A
yeah,
community will rally around and be like, oh, we have a problem. This wheelchair needs to go in that building. How are we going to fix it? And as long as there's not anyone stopping them, they're gonna find a way to do it. But I think that at some point we kind of squish some of that, and or we did for a long time, and we spent this time saying, oh, we're the government, we're going to help you, instead of saying, hey, we're the government, how can we help you do whatever it is you need to do?
Yeah,
So how
yeah.
do you, yeah, go ahead.
I think the biggest issue for a lot of us is that if they only listen, we'll tell them what we need. And I speak now as a person with a disability. If you'll only listen, I know you got it all figured out. I know you have a bunch of wheelchairs in the back, but I don't want to end up with a decubitus ulcer because you sat me on the wrong chair. I don't want to. And if my wheelchair's broken, I just want to get it fixed. I don't need you to perform miracles. I just want some things. And we're not talking about situations where it's so austere that you've got like no light. Everybody's using candles and all that. We're talking about where there's some infrastructure back in order. There are hospitals opening up and systems are not working. They're just not working. And you can't, if you're on Medicaid in an area that's been damaged and you can barely get your doctor on the phone or you can barely get anybody on the phone, well, how do I deal with having a cross state line? That will impact somebody's decision or not to evacuate, whether they think they're going to be taken care of after the disaster. And some people, as I understand it, made fatal decisions about that in places like during Katrina, where they didn't want to cross state lines because their Medicaid wasn't going to be any good. Folks just need to listen, and that's why the work that we were doing, especially in Region 4, which is where Florida, Carolinas, we had established what's called enhanced access teams, where their job was to not look at helping numbers of people, but find the hardest cases, bring the hardest cases to us. Let's talk. And it wasn't case management. It wasn't quite that deep, but it was more like, if you're bumping into systemic issues, then we need to talk about why the oxygen tanks are not getting to people in the Carolinas. I don't want to hear about it's the state's job and whose job. We got to get it done. And so we would actually drive out to areas, and we were only a few people. I mean, I had a wonderful cadre of folks of about 50 that would go to these disasters, but we got spread pretty thin. So we had to train other people to do that work too, so we could have force multipliers. And so I think as that work was happening, we had more people aware that you can't do a cookie cutter approach. You can't just assume that who you helped in that last disaster because you see a wheelchair, that's going to be the common theme. It's not. Everybody's different. So I think having people listen more is would be remarkable if we saw more of that.
And listening is hard. Listening is hard because we put it in our own context, right? We insert our own bias into it. We think we listened, but we just heard words and then we mashed them around in our heads to fit the model that we already had sometimes. And so that gets challenging. I I think one of the things that I like, it makes me cringe when I hear people say we're going to do the most good for the most number of people,
Yeah.
because we absolutely know that the most good for the most people leaves out all those people you went out to find, the hard cases. So what are your thoughts about how we change that mental model of most good for the most people?
I try to reverse it. When you make a society accessible, look at the airport, for example. When you make an airport accessible, everybody benefits. If you really want to do the most good for the most people, do the most for the people who need the most, and you're going to help everybody who has lesser needs. It's almost like they have to reverse this idea that if you've got 10 people you can fit on a helo, but one's got a big power chair, let's get the other nine out of there and we'll just kind of leave. You lose a piece of your soul as a country and society when you do that to people. When you have people who and besides, in New York, for example, Hurricane Sandy, those folks weren't a burden. You just weren't prepared. They were in those mid-rises because they were living their lives. When those elevators broke down, when those ACs didn't work, when you couldn't reach them, they didn't become your problem. You became a problem for them because you didn't do your job. And I think that if we have people stop thinking that they're going to get kudos for saving lives, I mean, that's not really the point. The point is to make saving lives as easy as possible before a disaster happens, so you're not worried about things that are inconveniences that you just didn't see coming. We know you're going to put 500 people in a shelter. If you can't get wheelchairs in there, then that's a you problem. That wasn't that person's problem. They're just living their lives. So I always make the argument that if you make society more accessible for people in wheelchairs, for example, every mom with a stroller, folks on gurneys who need to be transported out by an ambulance, people need to bring in boxes of goods, they benefit too. Automatic doors, everybody benefits. So I like to turn that argument on its head by pointing out that we actually got it wrong by looking at some people we can help and throwing everybody else away.
Universal design is a beautiful thing.
And it's not meant to be disability design. It's universal for a reason. It benefits everybody. And by the way, when you do that, when you help certain people, you're also hurting people who don't need the help, that are impacted by their loved ones being tossed away. There are a lot of caregivers, a lot of families. You don't want to be that family where your family member couldn't get on the helo because they've got a power. You don't want to be that one. When it affects you, you don't want to be that one. So that's why it's sort of beyond empathy. It's almost like you have to put people in that frame that they can't imagine being in before they understand.
There's probably there's a lot to be said. It's hard to imagine some of these scenarios until you've lived them at some point. They made an accessible playground in my city. It's been 15 years ago, and it's a
Hmm.
beautiful playground. Like you can roll a wheelchair onto the merry-go-round
Yeah.
because it's at ground level, right? You can there's a slope up to the top of the slide. And my niece, who is not disabled, loves that park just as much as every other kid, right? It doesn't make it worse for any kid.
And then
And,
think about it. And,
yeah,
and there's a and I don't mean it, I mean you just got me excited talking about that because people look at that like they're doing somebody a favor. What you're doing for that kid is making that kid agile, making that kid a problem solver. You're making that person somebody who can participate in their own evacuation, their own, way of existing. If conditions get austere, that's actually what you're doing. That's why you have playgrounds. You want kids to be active, and that includes kids who use wheelchairs. So that's, that there's always that context where we sometimes feel like we're being done a favor when that's not the case at all. We're actually empowered when we're given those kind of things. And I'm
yeah.
sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I thought about
No, you're good.
how exciting that must be.
Yeah, but those sorts of things, and it's sometimes it's so frustrating to have conversations and be like, but who's hurt by the who is hurt by having a wheel or by having a merry-go-round that you can just roll up onto, right? Nobody gets hurt by that. And then
Yep.
when you also fall off, like you don't fall as far either because everybody's gonna fall off the merry-go-round at some point.
Uh,
And there's simple solutions, but that took like I remember it was one of our city council members because her granddaughter uh, used a wheelchair, and she's like, my granddaughter is going to play in the park, and we're going to make
mhm.
a park that she can play in, and they
Yep.
did, and everybody loves that park, but
Mhm.
it shouldn't have had to have been this giant. It we shouldn't have had to campaign to have it. It should have just been.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, that's my side tangent, but I think that these things are they're ingrained in what we do because we spend so much time thinking, well, what do you need in a disaster? Well, you need the same thing in a disaster that you need right now today. And
Right.
we don't make that connection because we didn't go meet our neighbors or whoever beforehand. So I'm really curious what your thoughts are. This was a question that was submitted ahead of time, and I think it's really important. How do we I'm going to rephrase it a little bit. How do we modify our outreach and preparedness activities to be more inclusive of people with disabilities?
Well, you start by having people with disabilities be part of the outreach. We don't need the savior mentality to come in and tell us what we need and this and that, or bringing us to the proverbial table. We're going to make the table, and you come to our table and listen to what we're telling you because we're going to tell you exactly what we need, and it's going to work. But you have to be inclined to listen and not take this mentality that it's a zero sum game. Like if we help you all, it's going to take away from this over here, or if we let you all have too much of a voice, then everybody's going to want a voice. We've been fighting that fight since you know the Rehabilitation Act. Back when there were ugly laws. The last ugly law not expired, was rescinded in '73. This is in my lifetime. I was born in '72, and so we've had it in this country where it's actually illegal to be disabled and in public. We're still dealing with that mentality. So having people look at it as if we're designing the table this time, and you come to talk to us at our table is the model. That's the way you do that. We don't need disability whisperers, people who or know people. They can go in and they'll be the sort of proxy. No, come talk to us and we'll tell you. And I was glad to do that work as a disability coordinator, because even though I was a federal official at the time and I had to assume that role and represent the government, I never felt detached from the community I belong to as well. And that helped with accountability, because I said to myself, I'm going to make decisions as if I'm on the other side and somebody's having to make decisions that'll impact me. And I hope I did that. I tried to do that. But that was my mentality. And you get that when you have people participating and making decisions who are from the community that you're trying to help.
Yeah, that inclusive piece of it.
Right.
So I know you're a policy guy. Let's talk a little bit about policy.
Okay.
I got to say that you have one of the coolest jobs, I think. Like, what an amazing place to work and an amazing place to be able to work on policy.
Yeah.
But how do we, like, what do we do about policy? The question was, how do we include more people with disabilities? Well, we know how to include more people with disabilities. We ask them, but how do we advance the policy of disaster inclusiveness, for lack of a better term? I just made that up. So
Well, I mean, you have to be willing to, and I can't get too political, except I'll say that you have to be willing to hold lawmakers accountable. And there's not exactly like a voting block in this area. You don't have people voting based on this. But if you're in your home and you've never made a call to your congressional official about, the work that needs to be done, that's a missed opportunity, because you have the power to do that. That every district has a person who sits in the halls of Congress. There's what, 200, however many there are, that sit there and represent us ostensibly. And if you've never made a call, well, that's work left undone. That's a stone you haven't turned over. So if you get it, and veterans are kind of in the same, they're positioned the same way, where they've got to find a way to collectively create not an identity, but a voice. And if you get enough people saying the same thing, then you have people pay attention. And I think until it becomes the case where you've got enough people who are willing to make those calls and say, hey, Carolina's, the disaster didn't go too well during Helene. I'm not saying it did or did. I'm just saying as an example, make the call and say what's going to be different when there's another hurricane, and there may be in Western North Carolina. And if you're not doing anything different, or if you are, how can I be involved? And you have to go on the EMA websites for your state. Every state has an emergency management office, and they have a breakdown of some of the community engagement. If you haven't been invited, go find it, but it's there. And then read the plans. They've got all those plans published. And then find your the area where you want to be the voice. Be I call it being the mosquito in the tent. Anybody who's in the military, I know Vince was in the military. You don't want to be in a tent with a mosquito, because that thing will find you and you'll have lumps all over you. But that's how you need to be sometimes, and it's always been that way.
I like that. I was a camper as a kid, so I get mosquito in a tent too.
Yeah.
Just maybe with better food. I don't know.
Uh-huh.
It's interesting because I suspect, and I don't know this, I just know how after you've been told no or been ignored for so many times that maybe you're just like, I am tired of trying to make people listen to me. I don't think these people are going to listen. What what would you what would your advice be to people who are frustrated with systems and how they might find ways to move forward meaningfully?
Open up a laptop or a computer, open up a browser, and type in the name Judy Human, and then talk to me about what you've been through. That woman has done so much and has had to endure so much since she was a kid, and it was her life's work. Now, everybody can't be a Judy Human, right? But unless you've been to that point where you've done so much that people have regarded you as a champion, there's still more work to do. A lot of it is just getting out and talking to the right people. And maybe if you've done the same thing over and over, and I can't assume everybody knows who Judy Human is. Maybe I should have. She was a champion of disability access, who passed away a couple of years ago, I believe. And it was a loss because she was still so active, and her image meant so much, and that's what gives you the endurance. I was in the Marine Corps. We don't win every battle easily. Sometimes you take a lot of losses before you start to see the breakthrough, but you're still determined to take the hill. If you're the last one, that's where all these Medal of Honor recipients come from. It's the Marine Corps' birthday this week, so I have to pitch the Marine Corps. But we're in the same boat. People have taken their lumps before you, and it may be your turn to stand in and to keep pressing. And it may be every new administration in the White House, maybe it's every new rotation of folks on Capitol Hill. It's always refreshed. And so there's always another opportunity. And maybe it's the frustration because people don't have that long game mentality. They have that it didn't happen in 2 years, so I'm going to give up. In policy, you may not see a law passed for several cycles before it breaks through. But when that moment comes, you have to be strong enough to push it through. And I think that, the PCMRA, the Post Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act, is an example. That passed after Hurricane Katrina a year later, and that's why I had a job at FEMA. But that wasn't the first disaster where people with disabilities were dying. But it took that profile and that attention. And the people who were working on it benefited from all the work they put in because they had documents and history that they could talk about. Like this wasn't a new issue, but so I think we just have to be ready for the long game in a lot of these cases.
You reminded me of a book that's one of my favorite books from way back in grad school. And it's called After Disaster by Thomas Birkeland. And it's this hideous bright pink color, but it's about that. It is how
Yeah,
we go about the long game of
yeah,
policy and looking for those moments where like we are ready. Here's our moment. Let's
yeah,
make it go. But
yeah.
it takes coordination and it takes a lot of patience to actually move the giant policy ship.
And sometimes, and I hate to say it because you can't help but to be cynical, but sometimes folks count on you running out of steam. They do because they've got so many other things pulling at them. Nobody wants to prioritize a disaster because then that acknowledges that you may get hit with a disaster, and there's no way to win. There's never like a good disaster response. If one person died, that family is not going to look at. So you can't really say that there's ever a like a checklist of things that have to go right before people are satisfied. They're displaced. So nobody wants to think about that. So that's why it's going to be hard to get up that on in your platform and make that the thing that you're going to run on. But until it happens, folks don't really think about it, and that's unfortunate because we know it's going to happen.
Yeah, that's it. And it goes back to something you said very early in the conversation, which boiled down to people's perception of risk, right? You
Yeah,
talked about people doing for themselves, but it's that same sort of thing.
yeah.
My brain tells me that you, Sherman, you are susceptible to disaster. Like we know disasters happen, but you should get prepared. But my brain tells me I'm okay. I'm gonna be fine. Nothing bad's gonna happen to me. And until we break through that for everybody, we sort of sit at this weird impasse where people know disasters happen, but they're absolutely convinced they're not going to happen to them.
Well, what you don't want to do is you don't want to live your whole life being spooked by everything. I mean, when you think about how profound a disaster is, if you've ever been in a city where a tornado has ripped through there, it's almost like there's this term pathetic fallacy where you associate human characteristics to things that are not human, to weather. That's why we name disasters. The reason why we give hurricanes names is because people want to be able to direct their anger and exhaust that. And so it's easier to do that if you name it and humanize it, because then it's not a person, it's something so big that it was beyond anything we could do, but you still get to be angry. And so the reason why we name disasters, besides distinguishing one from the other, is so people have an opportunity to deal with the profound devastation in a way that's somewhat healthy because they can get it out and then they can move on, right? So, but you don't want to think about that the whole time. You don't want to live in Florida and be thinking, yeah, about a year from now, I'm gonna have everything swept away. But that's exactly what happens, and that's unfortunate because from where we sat in FEMA, we could predict it. We could see this is not going to go well. They rebuild Sanibel Island and places like that. I'm glad, and it may take 20 more years, but at some point, people need to think about that. So I would caution people with disabilities, think about where you live, and we're not going to expect you to direct your life around that, but at least know what the risk is. At least know if you choose to live in this area that's been prone to tornadoes, what's your plan? At least have a plan. Give yourself a chance to make it through. If you live in a hurricane prone area, just have a plan. And when the alarm goes off, leave. Leave. And if you stay, you're probably going to die. Like, you got to at least be thinking you're probably going to die, or you're going to put people in a position where they're going to have to get you and your chair out of there. And if that's your only plan, then you need to talk to other folks that are in your community to come up with something better. So that's not all you have to deal with. Don't just hope for the best, right? You have to really work for it.
Hope is not a plan.
Hope is
Yep.
not a plan.
Said every emergency manager everywhere. And yet we rely on it a lot.
Well, some of it is you can't really help it, because even as emergency managers, we respond. Like, we can't prevent the initial thing from happening. And sometimes hope works. I'll tell you an amazing story. One of my last tornado responses was in Tennessee, Clarksville County. And there was a baby that got snatched out of his mom's arms. And they found the baby alive in the tree. And believe it or not, the baby's first name was Lord. That's the baby's actual legal first name. You look it up. If you, Tennessee Clarksville tornado, if you type in baby tree, whatever the search words, the baby's first name was Lord. And I said, that kid is, so there's room for hope, but hope has to be backed up by something where we're accountable for it. We have to help hope happen. And I think that that's probably a better approach than to abandon all hope. We can have hope, but you got to do more than just
Yeah.
hope that it'll be better.
Yeah, like you without hope, like why do we do any of this? So yes, absolutely, I agree, but we got to have a plan too. We got to have
That's
a
right.
plan, and then we got to hope our plan actually survives first contact with the
Right.
storm. Like you're talking about naming storms. That I'm a book nerd, so you reminded me of a book called Acts of God by Ted Steinberg, and it talks about how much easier it is to blame God for things when it's a
Yeah.
storm than it is to
Yeah.
say, no, it's because we built houses where maybe we shouldn't have built houses.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
those sorts of things. It's a fascinating, they're fascinating reads to me because it puts things in a perspective that I think we sometimes lose.
Yeah.
And yeah, so um, let's see. There's another question that popped in over here. Um, ooh, this is a hard one. How do you ensure that people with hidden disabilities will be seen during a crisis?
That was hard, but it also was an issue that we confronted head on. We started to work with the autism community, as an example. You can't tell if a kid is autistic all the time. And what we started to do was to go to the different states, their conferences, or any opportunity to give. They need tools to do that, right? They don't want to fail. They don't want to start helping somebody and then they fail. That's a lot of times where the apprehension comes from. But when you empower first responders at the state level and a county level to understand that if you see a kid misbehaving, the first thing you should be thinking of, there may be an invisible disability. There may be a sensory overload. There may be, and we make the information digestible enough that it's not a mystery. There are other instances where, you have an elderly parent with dementia that may have to evacuate, and it won't be apparent. Sometimes you can't tell. So a lot of it is educating folks in advance, but that's where the disability community itself needs to be willing to engage folks before there's a disaster and go to the meetings and ask, what about these things that may happen? If we have 500 people in a shelter, you're going to have a few in there that are either going to be autistic or may have something like a severe depression, you know, any bipolar, schizophrenia, all those will be in there because that's society. How would you manage that? And that includes law enforcement. That includes having law enforcement brought into that picture. But that's where the community has to be aggressive about making sure that those education materials are making it to where the people who are making the decisions can get them. The worst thing is to find people who want to help, but they just don't have the understanding or the insight because it hadn't been given to. They, when would they know to ask for that? So a lot of that is closing those gaps when everything's quiet, when the skies are blue, and hope that that's a hope situation, and hope that that resonates when they're making decisions in real time, that they remember, okay, I remember hearing about kids who, need to be in a quiet area. So and they did that in Pasadena for the wildfire response, which was my last one. They actually had a designated quiet area. And I was surprised. I'm like, well, what made you all do that? And it's just so we're aware that there are kids who need this. And so there's enough momentum out there that we just need to ensure it continues in that
You know that
in the invisible disability area.
Yeah, that's a really good example because it's not just kids who need quiet areas. I
Right.
remember during where I ran one of I think actually the largest mass vaccination clinic in the country that was run by a city government, and there was a tiny bit of they just forgot to think about the fact that that's a sensory overload kind of situation for everyone, but particularly for people with autism or other spectrum disorders and and we punted in real time. We're like, we have a situation that we need to deal with. We're going to make a quiet space right now in real time. Find me a key to that room over there. That's going to be our quiet space now. And it should have been one of those things that was planned for in advance. Anytime you're going to have tens of thousands of people in a space, you can assume you're going to need that. And it got overlooked. But the people there at the time realized that they could fix this problem. They had the tools to do it. And
Mhm.
and whether they had the authority or not, someone assumed the authority and said, well, here's our fix. And everybody went,
Yeah.
cool, that works. And I think sometimes that's missing. I think sometimes we get so sucked up in bureaucracy that we forget that we can just fix problems to make people's lives better. And we do that to ourselves.
Well, and also in that situation, it surprised some of the responders that, well, if you don't have the space, we'll get some noise canceling headsets. I mean, there are things that you can do if you talk to the community. Ask people, how can I help you? What can I do? I don't know anything about this, but let me know. I'm in a wheelchair. That doesn't mean I know everything about every other disability, and so I even have to do that. But so we give them options, and we give them you don't have to be perfect, but you just have to listen. And you might find out you don't need a big space. That the noise cancelers work, maybe a little a toy that plays music. All those things are what parents will tell you for their child if they didn't have a chance to bring it with them. And by the way, parents need to be prepared too. Have that bag ready in case you have to do something like that. But there are, and when you have those conversations, you see the face light up because people are like, oh, that makes sense. We can run to Target and get a bunch of headsets and toys easily. We've done that. I've actually had to do that in Hurricane Beryl in Texas. We did that. So it's just if you're resourceful, will be resourceful in ways that you haven't had to before and become even more resourceful. It's a challenge we lay out to them.
Yeah. And it all starts with a conversation. Like at the end of the
Exactly.
day, a conversation can solve just about everything, or at least get you on the path to that
Exactly.
solution.
Yep.
So I think at this point, Elizabeth, do we have more questions? Or do people have questions that they are going to send to Elizabeth? Because we're kind of at the Q&A piece here.
I feel like I'm getting dark here. I'm in a parking lot and I'm darkening, but I don't have a light to turn on, so I apologize.
You're okay. It's okay.
Slowly disappearing.
We'll fix it in post or something like that.
Okay, that's fine.
No questions so far. So reminder to those in the chat, if anyone would like to come off mute, please raise your hand or drop it in the chat. But right now,
We answered them all. Everybody's good to go.
Well, Dr. Gillums, I have a question for you. Thank you so much for your amazing discussion today. And as safety providers, are there any things like tools, resources, or expectations that we can help empower people with disabilities as they're, going into shelters or going into these spaces? I know there was a trend for a while of in airports you wear a sunflower lanyard to kind of help signal that, and there's a lot of debate about that. But I would love to hear your suggestions on this.
Well, the one thing I'll say is that there are a lot of best practices happening that just don't get transferred to other areas. And I think that the more we can have convenings where people get together and exchange ideas of, what was tried. I saw the sunflower thing. I didn't quite get it at first, but then I saw it and I didn't know what to make of it. I didn't use it at that time, but I suppose that maybe somebody maybe saw it work somewhere else and then decided to try it at Reagan Airport. But don't be afraid to try new ideas. Don't be afraid to fail. Don't be afraid to get frustrated. I've been to disaster exercises where people with disabilities were part of the exercise. That was good to see. I think it was up in Pennsylvania where I saw the last one. It was good to see that because the scenarios, when they game out the scenarios, they're normally gaming it out based on sort of what the majority run into. So when they talk about things like, well, there's a food shortage or there's a water, a water problem, well, that takes on a whole new meaning for a big swath of the population that needs water just to stay alive, not just to drink, but to stay alive, to take medication, things like that. But you got to be a fly in the ointment. You got to be willing to be bothersome when when the skies are blue, so that it's a little more muscle memory when a disaster hits. Don't make it comfortable for people, especially when the skies are blue. Make it as uncomfortable as possible, and that's really a matter of finding the opportunities to be at the table when the emergency management agency is meeting. They usually publish that, so go on the state website, go to find the area, do like maybe a word search and look for disability, and see if they're having meetings with communities where they're listening to the community, and then show up. I've seen some places where the invitation was put out there, but folks weren't showing up, and that could be for a number of reasons. You got to have transportation and all that stuff. Um, but I think folks that need to look at their communities as their responsibility first and foremost, and then begin to, you know, take whatever that accountability means. Talk to the people, care about it when it's not that big of an issue, because that's when it's easy to blow it off. We don't want to think about hurricanes or tornadoes right now, but this is the time to think about it. And it's not going to be a waste of time. At some point, it's going to be exactly what the doctor ordered. And unfortunately, people don't appreciate that until after the fact.
All right, Vince, I see you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Dr. Gillums, thank you so much for being on. You have absolutely been one of my favorite people ever since I first heard you speak at an IEM conference several years ago.
Thank you.
I really would like to hear a little bit about your book and what inspired you to write it, and what is it about, and what can we expect to glean out of it when we pick that up for a read.
Well, the book isn't about emergency management. That's I did my doctoral studies on what I call nameism, and it was about the implications of a person's name on their learning experiences in K through 12. And I was looking at my own kids and the different ways that their lives played out. So I took an interest in how our names affect outcome. So I wrote a book about it because I'd already written a dissertation on it. I didn't want it to go to waste. Nobody's going to read my dissertation, but maybe they'll read my book. But I enjoyed that experience because it allowed me to get into the lives of people and I'm a better interviewer now. I am a better collaborator with people that are perhaps a disability population, people that are misunderstood, and the powers and the questions. And so that's what I took away. But that was what the book was about. That was sort of one of my bucket list items I got to check off by writing a book and getting it published.
That's really great. As a fellow PhD, yes, I agree. No one's reading my dissertation. They might read it in book form. So
Yeah.
I got one in book form just for my mom. Stephanie, go ahead. Your hand is up next.
Well, hello, my name is Stephanie. I am the Emergency and Disaster Resilience Navigator for the Arizona Statewide Independent Living Council. So I work at the intersection of disability and emergency management. And I just want to, I'm not sure if the audience is folks who work in the disability community or those that work in emergency management or both, but I would suggest if you do work in the emergency management community, if you've never connected with your statewide independent living council, which every state has, or your centers for independent living, I think that's a good place to start because they are cross disability and they work on helping folks transition or divert from places like nursing homes to living on their own. So they have a lot of input about folks in the disability community, and they all are folks who have disabilities. So I'm going to put in the chat how to, a directory of centers for independent living that you can get a hold of. So thank you, and nice to see you, Sherman. I remember when you presented at our Partners in Preparedness webinar.
Yes.
So.
And I have to say, Stephanie, you reminded me of something. The Centers for Independent Living became essential to my work. Anytime there was a disaster that would hit an area, obviously they were impacted because they were in the area, but they were also in a better position to, help us understand the needs of the disability community. Some even did feeding missions. I saw that in Puerto Rico a lot, where Mavi and SEPV were really active because they had to be. That was their home. Places like Florida, Pennsylvania's got a really active SIL. Not all SILs are the same. Some have to really get, either better understand the role they can play or get more resources. But having, a sense that the SILs are part of the community and also can be part of the response is real. That's a really good point, Stephanie, because it wasn't always like that, I believe, in Arizona. And now that they've got this navigator, I don't know how long you've been there, but I remember hearing about Arizona finally getting somebody to do that work, to centralize that work. Other places have done this for a while, but we wanted to see every state have a navigator, coordinator, somebody that we could pick up the phone and call, and then work with the SIL network to help with the ground game. So that's a real important point. I'm glad you brought that up.
All right. Any final questions before I hand this back over to Brandy? This was a delight, Sherman. Like this was one of those ones Matt's like, "Oh my gosh, I need help." I'm like, "Great, I will do it." It's always exciting to get to explore some of these topics that I don't necessarily spend a lot of time
Yeah.
in, but that I still care about a lot. So thank you so much for your time, even though you've descended into
I
darkness.
know I'm like a Dracula here, but I will say though that it's not so much that we can guarantee that everybody will know everything at the right time, but it's that one time that you learned something that you were glad you learned it. That may have been so random, and I see it happen all the time. I still run into people who know more about autism because they listen to a webinar or they learn from a past experience, and that wasn't their work, and they're not experts at it, but they just knew just enough to make a better decision rather than throw somebody out of a shelter for, misbehaving. Maybe find out what's going on. Is there more to the story? And I do see more of that. My hope, if I do have to have one, is that gets contagious. And as we become more connected through social media and all the ways that we're becoming sort of in each other's homes without being there, that with that we'll have greater understanding of the unique plight of people that we have to ultimately help in the role in the role that we play.
Yeah. One day it could be any of us.
Yes,
Like
exactly.
with the blip of a storm, suddenly it's everybody.
Literally. And people
Mhm.
do become disabled in disasters. I've seen that
Absolutely.
happen. So it happens.
I always tell people, take my glasses away and let's see what happens, right? I'm
Yeah,
going to need
yeah,
somebody to read for me, and we don't think about those things necessarily. So,
yeah.
anyway, all right. I think I'm handing it back to Brandy at this point. Thank you all so much for your time.
Right, thank you so much. So before we wrap up, I just want to say thank you so much, Dr. Gillum, for joining us tonight and sharing such an insightful and powerful discussion on accessibility and inclusion in emergency management. Um, and thank you to Sarah for skillfully facilitating tonight's conversation and stepping in for Matt Green. We really, truly appreciate you so much for that. And I'd also like to thank Spoken Here's Mandy Frey for providing ASL interpreting, Elizabeth Estrada for moderating the chat, and Vince Davis for opening up tonight's event and setting the stage for tonight's dialogue. Be sure to visit our partners using the links in the chat. Each of our organizations continuously offer courses, webinars, and learning opportunities designed to support aspiring and experienced emergency managers in strengthening their skills and advancing their careers. And that concludes our final roundtable of the year. The next EM roundtable will be announced in 2026. So stay tuned for updates, and thank you all for being a part of this important dialogue and for your continued commitment to advancing equity and excellence in emergency management. Have a great night, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.